Thank you for joining us again to another Central Innovation webinar. I'm your host, Nando Mogollon, and today, if you have been following this series of webinars, you may already know that today we will be focusing on IFC export from Archicad for the purpose of 5D or quantification, also known as estimation, although they might be slightly different. But the concept is we're going to optimize a model that we have, assuming that's going to be your project, and I'll have a sample project to play with that. We're going to export that file in IFC exclusively for the purposes of optimizing the quantification and estimation job that will happen afterwards. Now, I'm going to cover a couple of things. First, I want to review a few concepts. Within those, we want to take a look at what IFC and the specific MVDs are saying for quantification and estimation. Remember that the IFC schema and the MVD, which is a subset of that schema, are the ones that actually will provide you with the best information available within the schema for specific purposes. Therefore, we have model view definitions for transfer, for design transfer. We have others for coordination and so on. So we'll take a brief look at that and see what is there at the moment. Then, because we are focusing on the Australia and New Zealand market, we want to take a look at what's out there in terms of guidelines that may affect this whole idea of BIM for quantification and estimation. Then we'll take a brief look of why types, and with here we're actually referring to what it's called the IFC types are important, and material definition, because obviously those two things will be essential for quantification. And even though those two things might not be explicitly defined or required in those guidelines and the IFC schemas, those will be important to facilitate the job down the road. Then we're going to take a quick look at the exercise we're proposing. We're going to create a few modifications to the translator, which we're insisting on having specific translators for specific BIM uses. That is the whole idea. And then we'll follow on what happens with the model elements when we do that type of thing. We're also going to throw in an additional bit in there that doesn't have to do much with geometry, but rather with the properties that we export. And then we'll jump into a simulation of how that quantification will look like. But this time, I've decided to use Solibri instead of Archicad, since most of you are already a relatively good Archicad users, so you may know how to do most of these based on schedules and properties. But you may want to see what happens with that and how that happens when the model is being converted to an IFC model, which are different, which now will have a different composition based on your translation. And then we'll see how that behaves in Solibri, although Solibri it's not quite an estimating software, but it does a fairly good job at quantifying the elements from IFC. And you can actually export fairly good spreadsheets from it that can be then reused down the road with a specific software for estimation. All right, so that is essentially what we're going to take a look at. So let's go ahead and review the first concepts. So let's start with the process first. So what we're saying here, not much different to what we mentioned the last time. We're going to take a file that we already have in Archicad. We're going to save it as an IFC with a specific translator. As always, we advise to take a look at that file before you share it. That's your process of individual validation, so that you know what the other side is going to receive. And then we're going to pretend they're going to move that into a specific software for estimation. Now, again, as we advised the last time, sometimes I put a few lists of software that I'm aware of, that I've heard of, but this by no means is a total list of what's out there and what kind of software is capable. Not that we are either promoting or specifically saying that these are good, but these are some pieces of software that I have experience with, and I know that they're perfectly capable of doing the job. Costex, Creo, which is a relatively new one. Presto, it's quite a classic one already that have been moved from basic estimation into this digital BIM world. And similar to what happened with the sequencing in last week's webinar, what needs to be happening is that the model that you export from Archicad into IFC format should be as close as possible to that construction model that you're proposing to do. You'll find out, we won't have the time to read some of the documents, but you'll find that in the documents, one of the things they insist is that that model that you use for estimation reflects what, as close as possible, what will happen on site. So you don't have to derive quantities based on other elements. Rather, you measure quantities directly from particular model elements. Imagine the case of a flooring, right? Flooring, you will assume will be the same area as the ceiling, but that might not be the case if you have something like a bulkhead or a sloped ceiling and so on. So the idea is to have specific models that will reflect the construction model as much as you can. Now, an additional bit to this that refers to the IFC schema is the ability to include additional element quantities in a standard format that comes out of Archicad. Now, why will you do that? You may think, if you are, essentially saving a geometry down to an IFC so that that geometry can be measured down in this piece of software. Well, sometimes the original software will do calculations that are based on certain rules of thumb or additional considerations that the IFC geometry may not have. So including those is not a bad idea, and it will offer this estimating process an advantage because they can read some pieces of information, typically, values like areas and exposed surfaces, thicknesses of specific elements that may or may not be included in the geometry, down for the use of that specific software. So there might be quantities in here that you may want to transfer that may not necessarily be measurable or easily measurable from the IFC. So we're going to take a look at that. Moving forward into what IFC and the MVDs had to say about this, the current IFC schema 4 and the official model view definitions currently do not have a specific one for quantity takeoffs or quantification. Although, as you can see there's a draft that hopefully will come out soon. Can't say when, I don't have that information with me, but if you know, please share it. So there is coming up a model view definition that apparently will be specifically built so that the data and the relationships in between the elements and the definition of the geometry will be specifically built or defined for the purposes of quantity takeoffs. If we have that, this whole process will be a lot easier, so we don't need to guess a lot of this. And then what that means, which is information that is already there in the IFC schema 4, we just don't have a full defined model definition for it, is that there's a specific entity called quantity sets, which is not the same as property sets, but they look alike, for almost all of the elements, all the shared elements in the building. So basically what will happen is, in the official properties of an element, the element will have a certain number of values depending on the type of element. And those values will depend on the element that we're talking about. For instance, let me give you a brief look at that. So let's take a look at this one here. So what you have in there is the standard Building Smart website. And what I'm looking at is the IFC4 schema, just navigating through the entities here on the left, past the property sets, you'll find these quantity sets down here. Now let's take a look at that, just to look at a familiar type of element, walls. So this is the specific quantity takeoff set for wall quantities. And what you'll find in here that there's already a set of individual properties that will be transferred and should be transferred if you're using your model for the purposes of transferring quantities in a semantic mode. What that means is the BIM application tool that you're using, Archicad in our case, but others will use Revit or Vectorworks or SketchUp or whatever that is, they'll write a quantity set which will contain these individual properties, and the properties will be filled up with the values as they're coming from the authoring tool, not directly measured from the element, and that is the whole purpose of it. You'll read that most of these, they'll specifically say they are nominal values, and they have a few description of what are they measuring. Cool. So that is that. Before we jump back into our exercise, let's take a brief look at what the local for Australia and New Zealand standards will say about it. The first one I wanted to show you was same thing as I showed you the last time. The NatSpec BIM properties generator also has a series of properties dedicated for that. So if I go and scroll down the list in here, you'll see that they actually include a series of property categories for cost data. And according to them, it includes, well, that's beyond the basic quantities. It's essentially costing information, and they're all grouped under NatSpec BIM property sets. So if we want to grade those, we can, although maybe you don't have the authority to write that information in the file. Maybe that needs to be added by someone else. But even if that was the case, then at least locally, we have some guidelines over on how to define those particular properties. So those are there. Another guideline that you may want to refer to, it is it can be found inside the New Zealand Institute of Quantity Surveyors, although they have created these BIM best practice guidelines that actually apply to Australia and New Zealand, which is nice. And you can take a look at this. Just go to that website, nziqs.co.nz. And then you'll be able to freely download this PDF with a few best practices guidelines. Now, it's not very specific, but it offers a very nice introduction to the subject. I believe there's somewhere about page 13 where they actually get into specific bits. For instance, they mention here that, for example, generic models are not to be used. So that refers to classifying things correctly. Getting a model that gets closer to a construction model. So that's where they say the model should be modeled the way the project is physically be built, and so on and on and on. So there are a few very good specific recommendations, and they're worth taking a look. Okay, now we're good to move ahead, and we'll jump right into Archicad, and we'll start doing that bit of modification to both the model and the IFC translator. All right, so back here in Archicad then. You might be familiar already with this model. This is the one we've been using for the sake of this fake project. And all we have in there is pretty much like a shell, assuming that we have been invited to build that part of the model. And all we're doing from this point is essentially having the model as we had it the last time. We just haven't added much level of detail to this other than just adjusting our model view options for one that will specifically create an additional level of detail for curtain walls, stairs, and railings. Those are essentially, well, and some other ones for right there for building parts and objects. So we'll leave those pretty much the same way that we have been using it the last time. Let's go take a look in the IFC translator we have built for this. And again, what I've done for the purpose of just producing this is creating a specific translator for export, which I have named with the specific being used. So this will be architectural file for quantification and estimation. Same thing, I have created specific preset filters for the model filter, the geometry conversion, the property mapping, data conversion. All of them aligned in name just to make my life easier, and then I'll know that those are specifically used for that one purpose. Now, out of these, in reality, the only things and bits and pieces that I have modified for the purpose of this will refer to, first, the geometry conversion. In the geometry conversion, there are a couple of things in here that you want to keep. One of them, and this is essentially the same as the one we used the last time, essentially based on the level of detail we want to produce and the type of geometry. So we are actually using boundary representations as much as we can. We're also keeping the hierarchy, meaning that we're actually transferring our curtain walls, stairs and railings into elements that have individual parts, not just a single element, because we want to quantify things like glass or frames or, balustrades and so on. That really depends on how it's going to happen in the end, but we want to do it from the get-go. The property mapping is particularly special because, as you know now, there will be additional properties you may want to include. Now, because we only have half an hour in these webinars, I just went ahead and created a couple of additional ones for you to have an idea of what that looks like. So in these properties for export, I have included only for walls this NatSpec BIM group of properties with the conceptual cost property value. Now, I don't have that attached to anything. Didn't really think that was necessary at this point in time, but if you wanted to, you just need to create a rule and then attach that rule likely to an Archicad property of your own creation. Don't really have much of that on my own, but if you had one, it will be just a matter of going and selecting some parameter down there like that. Let me get rid of this. That's that. You'll find that nothing in there is actually describing the so-called quantities. So if we go back to this, there is no, for instance, beam wall quantities. I can't find these QTO wall-based quantities in there. So they're not displayed in here. Somehow, and I find it odd, but it is the way it's behaving right now, Archicad won't display those in these properties for export, arguably because these are properties and not quantities, but I will believe it might be good if they were displayed. Note that, let me close this, and let's bring, I'm going to click on OK in here just to make sure that you see the other side of that. Even if I bring the IFC project manager, you'll see that the IFC project manager itself doesn't have in here, other than the NatSpec group that I have created, doesn't really have the quantity takeoff values in here. Again, another thing that I believe it might be good to have access to, either from this panel or maybe an additional panel down here. So don't lose your head trying to find where they are. They won't be displayed right onto you, but they will be included. Now, where are they going to be included? If we go back to the translators, and then we go to the data conversion, in here, you can actually go ahead, actually it should be like that. In here, you can actually go ahead and select what do you want to transfer. In here, I want to transfer the properties that I have set in the mapping, so the previous mapping that I did. And in here, you'll have this option here that doesn't tell you much, but that's actually what it does. These IFC base quantities, this tick button here will create these quantities that we're looking at in here. So only by clicking in there, you actually will have the option to Archicad to populate the length, the width, the height, and so on values into the IFC file. It's just weird that they're not visible right away, but they will be included if you click that button. So for the purposes of estimation, this is highly recommended. Therefore, your model will be writing nominal values that can or may be used by the estimator to use later on. Additional to this, typically as always, I include classifications. They tend to use classification systems as well. They may have one already for costing. And then I also want to include material properties. The material properties will offer things like the density of materials, the brand, manufacturer, etc., etc., etc. If that is the case, and that will be embedded into the IFC file. Data conversion, that's pretty much what it is. Unit conversion don't have to change much. So that's essentially what you have. I'm basing this on IFC4 and the reference view, but it will be similar if you're using IFC 2x3. Now, that's pretty much what my translator will do based on my current view. And all I will do is, I already have an exporter for that. I'm just going to go ahead and export as it is by publishing it. And then what I should have on the other side, and let's show you that in here. What I have in here is the file that I've been using back in Solibri for the purposes of doing the quantification. So same building. The only difference is that since this is a federated project, I also have included the structural file as it came from the structural engineer. So happy to keep that. And my file, which is essentially a shell file for the elements that I have under my scope. So that's what we've got right there. Now, let's go and take a look at, just to use it as an example, what will happen when we bring things like walls with those additional properties. So the quantities properties. So let's go and select, say, this wall in here. And if we take a look at what Solibri has done so far is that the export we did from Archicad has included the quantity group of values, and Solibri will read that as an additional tab, pretty much in the same way that it reads a property set tab. So what you'll find in here is exactly those values we were talking about, so you can even compare those if in need. Let's go back here. So those are wall-based quantities. You'll have pretty much the same list. Might be ordered slightly different, but it's exactly the same list. The length, the width, the height, etc., etc. These values will be written by Archicad into these properties, and they're not actually somehow linked to the geometry. They were written at the time of export. Now, just for those of you that might be using Solibri, Solibri also reads these quantities tab, which is made up from the reading of the geometry. So it might be the case that in here, and this is pretty cool when someone gives you a file without the quantity properties. So if that is the case, the quantities tab inside Solibri will offer you general values based on the geometry of the elements, which is quite useful if you get a less than optimal IFC file. Anyway, not quite the subject or presentation, but that's essentially what it does. Now, I've got that. I've got the element. And now for the purposes of quantification and estimation, there are two additional things that you want to consider to be very, very important. One of them is the definition of types inside the IFC file, because that will be the way in which you can transfer some sort of typical elements or for recipes for estimation. Recipes meaning, that's going to be a type of wall that's going to be built with 2 layers of these studs, then insulation or no insulation, and so on and on and on. And you want to typify that. either for building elements like walls and floorings and ceilings, which are based on different skins over a layer, or for individual specific elements like counting doors, windows, panels, furniture, joinery, lamps, etc. So you want to keep types, and you will see that the types in here in Solibri, which is coming from the IFC, are called type, and then I can tell that somehow that looks like my composites, but then they have a number at the end. One thing that you may not be aware of, although we did touch base on that very early on the first, I believe, the third or the fourth webinar we did quite a few months ago, is the ability inside Archicad to actually produce those types. You might not be aware of it because it's not the kind of thing that is right up front, but you can actually create those types and rename them if it is necessary. So all you need to do is to use the project manager, then go to this second tab in here that says type products. And what you're going to get in here is a list of all the types per element that you're going to get. So for instance, you'll get in here, let me find the walls. There you go. So I've got wall types and I only have 4 of them. Concrete block, these ones here, these partitions, and these brick veneer type of walls. Now the naming, you'll see it's been grayed out and put in italics, meaning that it's been taken automatically by what Archicad does. You can actually modify that based on your translators and use the type elements, the green ones at the bottom when you use the type mapping. You can actually modify these if you wanted to. This seems to be a good idea, so you can keep it like that. Now, in the odd case where you may find the need or somehow you'll find yourself having to override that somehow manually, you can still do that simply by selecting the types you want to affect and then manually creating a name for them. Well, didn't do it there, based on those other rules that you may want to create. You can actually override that here, sort of faking it, moving away from whatever rules you have created in the translator. So you can modify that and have full control of that from there. That is important. The other thing that will be really important is the inclusion of materials. So everything that you put in there will have a series of materials. This partition in here, as you remember, it's being composed from different items. So these particular wall and all the walls of the same kind are actually composed into different element parts. For instance, I have the plasterboard on the outside, which is that, and then material will be plasterboard. Let's go up. And I also have, oh, that's precisely the one on the inside. So I was looking for, the timber stud, but don't seem to be able to select it like so. But I'll be able to do that if I choose the right thing. Anyway, what I'm looking for is to find the right material, but I want you to see that because of the level of detail that I have applied to this, the materials are not assigned to the entire element, but rather to its parts, which is actually what we want to do so that we can quantify the individual materials, which takes me to the next level of this, which is fine. How do I actually use something like Solibri or an IFC, which will be used by another piece of software to quantify the elements? So let's go to the area where Solibri does schedules, although they're actually called information takeoff. And then in here, I have pre-built a few of them for you to have a quick look. What we have in here is essentially a series of different schedules where I'm actually listing things given a particular criteria. In this particular case, I'm checking wall quantities based on their type. Therefore, type is important, assuming that I can quantify based on types. So this one will give me also with an override, very nice, visualization of my quantities. For instance, I can go and check visually what will be the content of everything that I have under 250 brick veneer. And those are going to be just apparently 4 walls. Although I'm pretty sure that that's because these are upper and lower walls. And then you get, and can include these 2 things. You can actually include the gross area, which has been taken from, if you can remember, these quantities that Solibri will derive from the model. But you can also read these quantities taken from the original modeling software, which will give you the information about the element as it was built in by the authoring tool, Archicad in this case. So you can get things like the side area, assuming that that's what these guys are going to use for estimating this. And then you can compare the two. Sometimes, like the case of these two are pretty good because they're exactly the same. There's some of them that might variate a little bit, like these ones here. You can see how the gross area and the actual net side area is slightly different. And that could be the case when you have, for instance, in this case, I can see there are quite a few exceptions there. The wall is being cut, probably because it's been intersecting with columns or somewhere else. So you can see all those differences in here and then take a judgment value for the sake of quantification. But the nice thing is you can actually quantify things based on their types. Take these, export it to Excel, and then throw it into a proper estimating piece of software. So you can do things based on element types and their types, by like so. But I can also do things based on, for instance, finding all the concrete, which is based on the material, not the element type. Therefore, material finding is important. For instance, this one I built here just for the sake, based on actually on the structural file, not the architectural one, to get the information from the real source. What I've done in here is base that material, or base the list of materials on the floors, so I can start quantifying depending on, assuming that we're going to be building this from bottom to top as it normally is. So therefore, I'll be having access to what type of material am I looking for, what are the volumes. So based on that, I can get totals of volumes of concrete that I may need to estimate on a timeline. Same thing will be if I wanted to, double check what's going to happen in the ground floor and so on. So all of that is perfectly possible. And, something like this will just give you a basic quantification of the elements. Similarly, I can go and check the elements that are built based on parts inside Archicad. For instance, the curtain walls. Let me do a quick refresh on this. It will be a good guide to find out a better way to optimize my facade. Right now, the one you see there is divided, color coding is divided by the size of the panels, because that's how I drive the types. And you'll see visually that some of them are quite different. So I haven't really done any work trying to optimize this anyhow. So that's why it is the way it is. But it will give you a good idea on which panels are the most popular panels in here. The 1 meter by 3 meters. It seems to be the majority of the panels. And then you'll find a bunch of them that are single panels, like so. But it will give you a very good idea, counting just the panels or glazing panels in the project file based on something like that. Similarly, I could quantify the framing, I could quantify doors, I could quantify pretty much anything as long as it is on the file. But note that what is important in here are those 3 things. Making sure that you have enough granularity on the model so that these panels are individual elements, not just the entire curtain wall, like so. So that I can quantify these bits and pieces. Number 1. Number 2, the ability to select individual types and then for you to name the types in a way that makes sense for the quantity takeoffs. And since in Archicad types are driven by translators, you don't have to have just one single list of types. You can have types for quantities, purposes, and then types just for the sake of project development or construction or design coordination. So they don't need to be the same. Based on this, you have the ability to quantify individual levels, so good level of granularity. And the second thing, as I have demonstrated with this, say the concrete, you can also derive this by the type of concrete and different concrete strengths. Therefore, which is not exactly what I did. I decided to do it by the level, but it will be the same if I, instead of having types, I'll have the material. Then what you'll get in there is a list of different concrete strengths that you can quantify with a certain additional ordering list, like the floor or maybe the type of element. And therefore, material will also be used for the sake of quantification, probably one of the most important things, because of course, you need to know what is it that you're pricing in there. Okay, so that is what we had to show you this for estimation and quantity takeoffs today. I hope it was useful. Remember, we're going to continue with these series of webinars on a weekly basis until roughly the end of the year. Next webinars will be focusing on some of the legal aspects and risking aspects of IFC deliverables. So we're going to focus first on quality assurance, both in Archicad and highly on Solibri, since it will be probably the most appropriate tool for that purpose. But of course, assuming that you guys are producing your models with Archicad, and more likely combining those with both IFC files coming from Revit, which is, again, just due to popularity, most of the situations that you'll find yourself in, and a bunch of other incoming information in DWG shape or PDF shape. So probably going to do that all combined in Archicad, and a little bit of that in Solibri, and a little bit of that also in Archicad. If you want to take a look at when those webinars will happen, this QR code there will take you to the website if you use your camera on your phone. Otherwise, just use that link there on the screen. CI Archicad events if you used Bitly service. Other than that, in Australia and New Zealand, you can get support via the hotline or just going through the MyCI portal, or use the emails, which will take you to the same ticket creation process. Don't forget to register and check the content we have on MyCI, including a history of these videos that we've been recording. There is temporarily a list of those videos in our channel on YouTube. So if you want to catch up on those, you can also do a quick search based on IFC collaboration, Archicad, or similar. Those are the keywords, but you're probably going to find them anyways. And easier to find if you just log in under myci at centralelevation.com. Stay tuned for next week's webinar, and we'll see you then.